It's a nice day and a lot of other things you could be doing. You could be over at 1600 Pennsylvania, ogling bowl, and walking them and doing something. You know, I'm interested to see, Obama wanted to break new ground, and I guess he may someday if we wait long enough. But what I notice is that he seemed to have taken a tip from Harry Truman, another Democratic president. Truman once said, after being in this town for a long while, he said, in Washington, if you want a friend, get a dog. And so Obama has done that. Enough of the past, onto the book. This idea came about 3 years ago from an obituary that I read in the Washington Post. The subject was a man named Fritz Littlejohn. He'd lived a full life, and he was 97 years old. And he'd been most of his life in television news. But the reason that he rated this obituary was that he had was the main reason that the Army McCarthy hearings, the subject of this book, excuse me, see if I can balance this glass on without doing it. Everybody will keep your eye on the glass if you if you see it teeter, let me know. Anyhow, he made it possible for the hearings to be televised and for McCarthy and for history to be made. There were three major networks then, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Now, CBS and NBC were much more successful, and they had soap operas on during the afternoon hours when the hearings were. And there was money in the soap operas, and they didn't want to give it up to do some hearings that who knew what would come of it. Well, ABC didn't have the soap operas, and so they didn't have the money to sacrifice. And Littlejohn convinced them that it would be a good investment for them to do the hearing. So they did, and so while the book says, and I hope shows how the television finished off McCarthy, it's worth remembering they did it in a sense with two hands tied behind their back. Of the three networks, only one did the broadcast. The other two did summaries of them, and the impact on the American people was tremendous. Now, I read this obituary and was struck by thinking about it, because I think in terms of books is that there had been a number of books about Senator McCarthy, but there hadn't been any book that dealt specifically with the Army McCarthy hearings. And I thought that that was a subject that was worth a book and worth thinking about, and worth people reading about, for two main reasons. One is that the hearings illuminated the strain of political paranoia that seems embedded in our national DNA. Now, McCarthy was one of the biggest, most successful fomenters of political paranoia in all our history, certainly in the last century. Now, don't get me wrong, as Henry Kissinger said, even a paranoid has real enemies, and so even countries seized by paranoia face real dangers. And communism certainly was a danger to the United States then and to the rest of the world, free world, so-called. And as terrorism is today. But the problem with paranoia is that sometimes politicians use these fears and concerns and exploit and play upon them, and that distorts the danger, and so that we don't wind up, instead of facing and resolving and keeping the nation safe, it tends sometimes to make things worse. That's what happened during the era of McCarthyism with the Red Scare. And that's what I feel has happened more recently in the last few years with the so-called war on terrorism, in which George W. Bush and so-called Vulcans, led by Richard Cheney, and these folks had fanned fears and irrational concerns in the same way. And the disturbing thing about this is that the media too often goes along with it and fans it and exacerbates it. So that's one of the main points I wanted to make in the book. And there was another, and that has to do with the importance of television and the impact it's had on national politics, which really, which the McCarthy hearings paved the way for. Now, probably this would have happened anyhow. Television, I guess, would have come to dominate our politics, but it was the McCarthy hearings that catalyzed this event and made it inevitable and made it sooner. Let me give you the backstory. And when I talk about television politics, it's not just the television and the impact. It's not that television is not the biggest boy in the block. It's just changed the way the game has been played. And I think you'll see this. Now, let me give you the backstory on this hearing, so to speak. When they opened in the caucus room of the U.S. Senate, this 55 years ago this very month, and they did go on for 36 days, stretching all through the rest of the spring into the summer. Many in Washington thought that history was in the making. The proximate cause of the controversy between McCarthy, the Wisconsin Senator McCarthy, and the Army that boiled over and forced the hearings was pretty small potatoes by historical measurements. At the center of the dispute was a former aide to McCarthy's investigating committee, G. David Schein. He'd been inducted into service as McCarthy was in the midst of a probe of alleged spying at one of the Army's most sensitive installations, the Signal Corps Center at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. In what amounted to an indictment of McCarthy and his staff, made public a month before the start of the hearings, the Army charged that McCarthy and his staff had relentlessly pressured the military to get favorable treatment for Private Schein. The Army claimed to be offended and indignant about all this. But what undercut the Army's professions of indignation was the way they'd reacted to McCarthy and Schein. Instead of slamming the door in McCarthy's face, the Army had gone out of its way to be nice to him and to Schein, to play up to him and to appease him. And that was the substance of the charge that McCarthy and his cohorts fired back at the Army. They charged that the Army was trying to use Schein as a hostage of sorts, trying to use Schein to get McCarthy to ease up on his investigation. So here you had two powerful elements in the government, a Republican senator who was at that time probably the most feared politician in the land, and the United States Army, which was part of the Eisenhower administration, and they were at each other's throats. So this was such a mess. The Senate decided that the only way to straighten it out was to have a hearing, and of course what this did was made it an even bigger mess, but there was no avoiding him. It was also a prurient note adding spice to this brouhaha. McCarthy himself said several times to the Army that Schein, who had been an aide to the committee, was really not a whole lot much of a help, that he was more of a publicity hound than anything else. So what was the fuss about Schein? Well, Schein's most ardent supporter, in every sense of the word, was McCarthy's top aide. The brilliant, ruthless, and unscrupulous, you could mention almost any extreme adjective would apply, Roy Cohn. The real bond, some said with a wink and a smirk, was between Cohn and Schein, and it had little to do with subversion except as it applied to middle-class morality. And some people even suspected that McCarthy was in on the action. Lillian Hellman, a liberal playwright, in fact, referred to them both, referred to the three of them, Schein and McCarthy and Cohn, as Bonnie and Clyde. So, of course, you have to remember that Lillian Hellman was the woman that Mary McCarthy said of whom everything she says is a lie, and that includes and the. So you could take that. But what transcended the petty details of this argument between Schein and how he was treated and what he and Cohn really had in common was The stature of the two chief protagonists